Good afternoon, everyone. This is Christina Osborne with the ISO Stakeholder Engagement Team, and I'd like to welcome you to the first working group meeting related to the native load and available transfer capability calculation topics. This is part of phase 2 of the External Load Forward Scheduling Rights Process Initiative. We have two presentations today. I'm going to go ahead and go to the agenda. First, Milos Bosanek from ISO's Market Policy and Performance Team will provide an overview of the working group structure and overall objectives, and then Arnie Quinn from Vistra Corp will present FERC's Native Load Preference Policy. These two presentations and other related materials are available on the initiative webpage on ISO's website. Stakeholders will have several opportunities to ask questions during the session. I'll provide instructions for how to raise your hand at that time. We'll first take questions from the working group members, then others who are on the speaker line, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the stakeholder participants. We are recording this event for information and convenience purposes only, and just a reminder that any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without ISO's permission. These working group discussions are intended to foster open dialogue, sharing of ideas, perspectives, and overall brainstorming on the different topics in the subgroup. These discussions may not be representations of official company perspectives and should not be treated as such in order to foster open dialogue and idea sharing. So with that, I would like to turn the meeting over to our first speaker, Milos Bosanek.
Thank you, Christina, and good afternoon, everybody. We have the agenda in front of us. I think we can definitely dedicate more time, particularly to the native load preference discussion from Arnie. So we don't need to constrain ourselves necessarily to these timeframes. There'll be opportunities to ask questions throughout both of these presentations. But let's go to the next slide, and I'll provide for a few minutes. I'll provide a little bit of an overview of the working group, the structure, and the schedule, particularly for working group 1. I'll also note on a side note for just a second that the name of the initiative is External Load Forward Scheduling Rights Process. It's a little bit non-intuitive as to what we're trying to address. So we will be updating the name for this initiative likely later this week. We have market notice, and we're going to call it Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities. That's a side note. Just be on the lookout for that. But we got some feedback that the name is not necessarily intuitive as to what we're really addressing in the initiative and in these working groups. So we'll be updating that name this week. Okay, I want to provide a little bit of background on the working group and scope, and then I'll pause for questions after I get through these few slides. As part of this initiative, the External Load Forward Scheduling Rights Process Initiative, the ISO has identified that we would be developing a transmission reservation process as a durable framework for establishing scheduling priorities in the market. And to that end, we noted in the issue paper, and we introduced that we wanted to leverage collaborative stakeholder working groups to help us inform development of different aspects of the transmission reservation process framework and leverage the experience really and the expertise of our regional partners in helping us inform what that process could look like. There are 3 working groups that are being formed as part of the overall initiative looking at this longer-term framework. And this is the first working group that is focused on the topic of how do we calculate native load needs and ultimately the available transfer capability, or the ATC, that can be reserved by other transactions that want to transact across our system, particularly wheel-through transactions. These discussions are going to help us consider how the ISO, like I said, can calculate or derive the transmission capacity that's needed to serve native load needs, and then also derive the amount of transmission capacity that's available for other transactions to reserve across our system across different time frames. Some of the things that I hope we learn more about throughout these sessions, and we'll have a number of sessions that I'll talk about later, is that we would ultimately need to consider as well, what are the different inputs and assumptions utilized in order to calculate native load needs? How are the different margins calculated for transmission service and that can be reserved to meet particular needs? And I think Artie is going to cover a little bit of that in his presentation. And how do we ultimately, how do the calculations account for different aspects of uncertainty when serving load, and ultimately how then those native load calculations are utilized to derive the ATC that may be available for wheel-through transactions to reserve. Throughout these discussions, really the goal is to understand the common practices, discuss how the ISO could then derive the native load needs and identify an amount of ATC for other transactions such as wheel-throughs across the system and across different time frames. As I'm going to note a bit later, these are open discussions, and we will have several transmission providers across the West share their perspectives in upcoming working group discussions. And we certainly invite other stakeholders, whether they're part of the working group, a core working group, or outside of it, to share their ideas, perspectives, ask questions, and share any type of proposals that we can discuss more broadly in this working group, focused on calculations of native load needs and ultimately the ATC across different time frames. Let's go to the next slide, please. Just a little bit about the participants of the working group. We had a number of organizations identify interest and commit resources to actively participate and engage in these working groups, and particularly Working Group 1, the one that we're starting today. These entities volunteered and self-selected to participate in the working group, and we have been working around the schedules of those different entities to identify the availability and schedule and arrange these working group meetings. But these meetings are ultimately open to the public. We noticed them on our calendar. We've issued a market notice, and any stakeholder that's interested in this particular topic can call into the participant line, and there'll be opportunities as well to provide input, questions, and feedback throughout the meeting and throughout the upcoming sessions. We recognize that there are different levels of interest in some of these topics, and not all stakeholders are necessarily able to dedicate resources to the discussion. So to the extent stakeholders are interested, we certainly welcome your participation in these working groups as much as you can. In particular, this particular working group consists of participants from the organizations that you see on this page: BPA, CPUC, 6 cities, Vistra, California load serving entities. These are your investor-owned utilities, as well as a number of CCAs that are represented, and then Idaho Power Company and Salt River Project. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, a little bit about the schedule, upcoming schedule for this working group, and we'll give you a little bit of insight into the upcoming topics as well as part of this working group. We're going to schedule additional working groups than the ones that you see here, and Christina is going to reach out to the group members to find some additional times that carry us into mid-December or so. We recognize there's a need for at least a couple of more sessions to provide other parties an opportunity to present and share any of their perspectives. And we encourage those on the working group and other stakeholders that are calling in, if you would like to present at any of the upcoming meetings, share ideas or proposals to be considered, please let us know, and we'll look to find a time to accommodate your presentations. We really want to hear from you. Okay, so today we start with, this is the November 10th meeting. We're going to focus again on my presentation here, just providing an overview of the working group, setting the stage for the scope and what we're going to cover in the upcoming meetings. And then Arnie is going to talk about, from Vistra, about the concept of FERC native load preference policy, and there'll be opportunities to have a dialogue and ask questions throughout that presentation. On November 15th, we have another session scheduled from 9 to 11 a.m., where Idaho Power Company, the transmission function, was gracious enough to take a little bit of time and share their practices on how do they calculate native load needs and ultimately derive ATC across different time horizons. So they're going to have a presentation, a discussion for us, and there'll be opportunity in that meeting to ask some additional questions and learn from their practices. On November 19th, also from 9 to 11, we'll have the Salt River Project share their practices about how they calculate, again, native load needs and calculate ATC across different horizons. And similarly, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions and learn from their practices. Then on November 30th, we have BPA sharing their practices, and we really appreciate both SRP and BPA making themselves available. And they'll share their practices as well on how do they calculate native load and network load needs and derive ATC. And if there's time, I think we'll schedule it this time, but Vistra as well wants to share ideas or a proposal or a potential framework to consider in this context. And like I said, we will be scheduling additional working group sessions that take us into mid-December, so likely 2 more or so, depending on the availability of the group members and any other stakeholders that are interested in presenting. We certainly let us know, and we'll add you to those upcoming working groups. We should have that schedule updated here in the next week or so, and we'll post that on the initiative webpage with the additional dates. Okay, let's go to the last slide. I think this is it. Yeah, so just to close out then this overview, I want to just cover just some logistical items. As I noted, while we have a core working group of members that are self-identified participants, these discussions are open to all stakeholders. We're going to pause for questions, both for questions from the core group members that are on the speaker line, as well as those that are on the participant line throughout the presentation. I'll pause after this slide for questions, and then Arnie as well as we're going through his presentation. And as Christina noted, these will be recorded and posted on our initiative webpage. They provide additional transparency on the working groups, and parties can go back if they missed a particular working group. They'll have a chance to listen to that if they couldn't participate in person. But I want to make sure that the parties are comfortable speaking up and sharing ideas and perspectives, and any aspects of discussion in these working groups are really for discussion and brainstorming purposes only. The intent here is to foster an open dialogue. I'm going to pause for questions now, but just before I do that, I want to just thank Vistra for volunteering and Arnie for making himself available to make his upcoming presentation. They will cover the topic of native load priority and for guidance on that topic. I think this is going to set a good introduction into the topic and the discussions that are going to happen here over the next few working groups. They'll help us identify key concepts that will be important to understand throughout the discussions and future presentations from our regional partners. I think it will highlight some of the key terms that you're going to hear, or we're all going to hear over and over in the upcoming working groups. And I think it's going to be a helpful discussion. Please feel free to ask questions as Arnie goes through that presentation, and any questions or clarification. So let's have this be an open and collaborative dialogue, and we really appreciate all of you joining. So let me pause then for questions just on the working group logistics or anything that I covered in these few slides, and then we'll turn it over to Arnie. And Christina, maybe you can remind folks just how to ask questions.
Sure. And so what we'll do is we'll go ahead and start with questions from the working group members, then go to the rest of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to the stakeholder participants. So if any of the working group members have any questions, you can raise your hand by selecting, there's a little hand icon above the chat window, so go ahead and click on that. Let us know if you have any questions. And you can unmute yourselves as well, but I'll call on you if you have questions. Okay, don't see anybody with their hand raised on the panelist side, so let's go ahead and open it up to the rest of the stakeholder participants. So again, if you have a question, just select the hand icon above the chat window. If you just dialed into the meeting, you can press #2 on your phone. Adam, let me know if anybody enters the queue.
All right, and I do not see anyone in the verbal question queue at this time.
Okay, so we do have a chat question from Dan Williams, CES. And by the way, feel free to send your questions in the chat. It looks like Dan has his hand raised, so Dan, I'll let you ask your question verbally. So if you can open up his phone line, please.
All right, Dan, you're unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Christina. I just wasn't sure if my connection was very good today, but hopefully I'm coming through okay. Yeah, so Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. So Neil, it's just a couple kind of high-level questions here. The first is just for phase 1 of the initiative, is there any update on kind of the next proposal release timing or next meeting timing that you can share?
Yeah, thanks, Dan, for that. Yes, we're anticipating publishing the proposal on phase 1 next week, at some point next week.
Okay, and then but still on the kind of same general cadence for like the board meeting approval in the spring.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, March. March.
Do you expect on these phase 2 working groups, during the working group meetings, do you expect to take written comments from stakeholders, or are you asking folks just to kind of compile those and share them at the next working group meeting if they need some time to think about it during the prior working group?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think we're open certainly to suggestions. If you have any questions during the meeting, obviously, feel free to bring that up. If there are any follow-up comments or questions to topics, it may be good to, if you need more time, maybe send it to us to ISO Stakeholder Affairs. If it's on some topics that have been covered in some of the presentations, we can share those questions with the presenters, and maybe they can follow up and provide answers to those. So I think that's a good question. Let's maybe target, if parties have any questions coming out of these working groups, send them to ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and then we'll look to respond to those at the following meeting, or we'll respond to them offline if it's something straightforward. If it's, but let's dedicate a little bit of time at the start of every future working group meeting just to cover those logistics. If we receive any kind of questions or comments, we can cover those at the beginning of the next meeting.
Yeah, that sounds great. And then I think the last one I have, just kind of for the initiative in general, is just, is there kind of a target for implementation that stakeholders should have in mind? And I ask that mostly around any potential dependencies on the development of the EDAM design and potential outcomes there. And just like, should we be thinking about these options in the context of the current market, or think about them as sort of in parallel with what might develop around EDAM or other market changes out in the next 2 or 3 years?
No, that's a great question. I think the way that we talked about this is we're targeting at this point for phase 2, 2024 implementation time, beginning of 2024. But I think, as I noted in our issue paper, and maybe I think the stakeholder meeting is, that is a target at this point, but it will all depend upon the level of complexity and the structure of what that phase 2 framework looks like. So what we've noted is we're going to evaluate after we have opportunity to discuss some of these topics in these working groups and think about, the information that we get from these. I think we should have a good sense of what that phase 2 framework looks like this next summer. And at that point, we can, based on the complexities and the structure that it looks like this is going down the road of, we can then reevaluate that timeline. But at this point, the target timeline is 2024 implementation.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds really good. And I imagine as we get through the different working groups and they build on top of each other also, then we'll get further along in EDAM and it'll become more clear how to line up thinking about some of these things. So thanks. Those are the questions I had.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. All right. I don't see anybody else in the queue. I'll give one more last opportunity. If anybody does have questions, go ahead and select the hand icon above the chat window. Or you can send it in the chat box to either myself or all panelists as well. Give it a moment.
And I do not see any questions in the verbal queue at this time.
Okay. Any questions from panelists before we move on? All right. Great. Thank you, Milos. Okay. And next we do have Arnie Quinn from Vistra, who is going to present the FERC's native load preference policy. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Arnie. Just a reminder to unmute yourself on your end.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes. Thank you.
Excellent. First, let me just say we really appreciate you giving us the opportunity to share our perspectives on this topic. We think, as we were starting to think about kind of the overall stakeholder effort, we we kind of fall back on, the view that kind of as you get started, it's helpful to kind of be grounded in, how FERC has traditionally thought about open access issues and native load preference. I should have introduced myself. I'm Arnie Quinn. I am the Vice President of FERC Jurisdictional Markets for Vistra. In that role, I coordinate our activities in the FERC jurisdictional ISOs where we participate. That's California ISO, ISO New England, and PJM. And then I also coordinate our activities at FERC. Prior to joining Vistra about 3.5 years ago, I spent about 14 years at FERC. I started my career in the Office of Enforcement. I actually started my career doing audits of the open access rules, and then I was on the team that worked on Order 890. So, I think we're all burdened by our history, and for us, that history includes a lot of time at FERC working on open access issues. And so as a result of that, when we start these kind of conversations, we start with a grounding in what has FERC said about these issues before. And in a lot of cases, what it has said about these issues comes out of Order 890. I want to be clear that I'm speaking on behalf of Vistra. I'm providing, my own perspective on what FERC's native load preference policy has been. I don't want to pretend like I am speaking for FERC, because obviously I can't, because I don't work there anymore. I also don't want to pretend that, I am predicting how FERC would approach any new proposal by the ISO. But I think what they have said in the past, and it's a fairly long history, is informative to how they'd approach the issues going forward. Next slide, please. So, as a high-level agenda, I want to talk about, again, using kind of the words that FERC has used, why we would start this policy discussion, start with a policy discussion instead of, jumping directly into kind of the methodology and the specific assumptions. I then want to spend a little bit of time on the general statements that FERC has made about the native load preference, both in the recent order on the ISO's wheeling, import, and export proposal, but also kind of in Order 890 as it was cited in that order. But then, I think that high-level kind of discussion from FERC quickly gets you into implementation details and implementation elements, and the real policy starts to kind of show itself through how FERC has approached each one of these implementation elements. And the ones that we think are the most relevant are how FERC approaches designated network resources and how those designations are used to establish existing transmission commitments, but also believe that the capacity benefit margin and to a lesser degree the transmission reserve margin are also elements of the ATC calculation that can inform how FERC approaches how native load should be allowed to set aside ATC to serve its needs. Next slide, please. As we were putting this together as a team, Kathleen reminded me, and give her credit for helping all of you, that there are a lot of frequently used acronyms in the open access world, and because a lot of us aren't in the open access world on a day-to-day basis anymore, they are more foreign than some of the acronyms that we use in our markets world. So, we just thought we'd start with a slide that had the frequently used acronyms. I also, as much as I could, when I'm citing to Order 890 or another order by FERC, I tried to use their language, and sometimes their language was in acronyms. So again, we're hoping that this slide would just be a good reference for folks to touch back onto to the extent that an acronym seems foreign. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, from our view, you start with a policy discussion because FERC, NERC, NASB have all acknowledged that there are multiple methodologies that you can use to calculate available transfer capability. Those multiple methodologies are enshrined in NERC standards, NASB standards. So the methodologies are really important to understand, and I think we learn a lot when we see how individual companies have implemented the way to calculate available transfer capability. But there are a number of them. And I think importantly, FERC has noted that it's not the methodologies for calculating APC themselves that create the opportunity for undue discrimination. Instead, that potential for undue discrimination stems from two main sources. One is the variability in the calculation of the components, and two really is a lack of detail in the description of those APC calculation methodologies and the underlying assumptions used by the transmission provider. The example that FERC gives in Order 890 of kind of where they think this potential for undue discrimination comes in was, you have utilities A and B. They both agree that APC is derived by reducing the total transfer capability by the sum of existing transmission commitments, capacity benefit margin, and PRM. But utility A may define EPC to include set-asides for contingencies, while utility B may not. I think before I take questions, I'll just emphasize, for everything that FERC has traditionally done on open access, the real touch point comes back to the potential for undue discrimination. So, in trying to evaluate, whether utilities A and B are doing it right, in air quotes, or there's some concern with the way that those utilities might be doing it, FERC's point of view would be, does the way one utility is doing it different from another utility, does that create potential for undue discrimination? And if it does create that potential, then FERC would start to be concerned. So this is a good spot to pause and see if there are any questions.
Great, thank you, Arnie. So start questions from working group members. Just a reminder to raise your hand, use the hand icon above the chat window, and I'll call on you, but you can unmute yourselves on your end, by the way. Give it a moment or two. Okay, any of the other panelists have questions you want to raise? Okay, I don't see hands raised on the panelist side, so we'll go ahead and open it up to questions for the rest of the participants. Again, press the hand icon above the chat window if you're in WebEx, or press pound Q on your phone. Or you can send your question in the chat.
All right, and I do not see any questions in the verbal queue at this time.
Okay, I don't see any chat questions either, so go ahead, Arnie.
All right, great. So we can go to the next slide, please. So, what has FERC said, generally about the native load preference? And, here I do think it's really informative to look back at how FERC approached the last filing that the ISO made, and, what they identified as, what the native load preference represented. And here, when I went back to look at the order, it really cites Order 890 and the nature of the native load preference in two spots. It referenced paragraph 107, which is in the native load preference section of Order 890, and there FERC did pretty much a direct quote from the language in Order 890. Simply stated, CAISO's proposal is consistent with the balance described in Order 890 between the transmission provider's need to meet its native load obligations and the need of other entities to obtain service from the transmission provider to meet their own obligations. I think that's helpful language. It identifies that there is a balancing going on. That it's not simply that the native load gets a unilateral or absolute preference, but rather that preference is balanced against the needs of other users of the transmission system. And again, this language is really straight from Order 890. Looking back at Order 890, the native load preference section is pretty short. There's not a ton more that FERC says about the native load preference, and I'll kind of get to why I think that might have been. The other quote that FERC made to Order 890 in the priorities order, went to the fact that Order 890 permitted transmission providers the ability to calculate transfer capability in a way that allowed the transmission provider to meet generation reliability criteria in serving native load. And that sounds pretty broad I know it sounded pretty broad to us. And it was helpful for us to go to that part of Order 890 and to appreciate that that's a quote from the part of Order 890 that talks about the capacity benefit margin. And there is a little bit more detail, and you'll see, and for folks who've peeked ahead at the presentation, we talk more about what FERC has said about capacity benefit margin and how it should be used and when it can be used. But going to the paragraph that FERC quoted in the priorities order, it really talks about the right to set aside transfer capability as this thing that is called the capacity benefit margin to meet historical state RTO or regional generation reliability criteria, such as reserve margin, loss of load probability, the loss of the largest units, et cetera. In there, you start to see that FERC is talking specifically about kind of meeting a planning standard or a reserve margin standard. Next slide. So, at a very high level, the native load preference, as we read Order 890 and as we read the priorities order, it's about a balance between kind of native load and other users of the transmission system. And it recognizes the need of the native load customer and the transmission provider, in this case the ISO, to be able to set aside some amount of available transfer capability to meet reliability criteria. How do you do those things? It really is, in our view, through the assumptions, requirements, and calculations of the components that are used to determine ATC. So, while there's a little bit of guidance in what FERC has talked about in terms of the native load preference, this is one of those unfortunate situations where you really kind of got to get into the details to really understand the policy. And those details go to the existing transmission commitments associated with designated network resources, which FERC has talked a lot about and really has been the topic of a lot of enforcement cases, discussion in Order 890, cases in front of FERC, after Order 888. And then capacity benefit margin and transmission reserve margin, which have been a little bit less kind of actively litigated at FERC. So I'm ready now to kind of jump into some of the more detailed discussion about these different elements. This is probably another good spot to pause and see if there are any questions about the setup.
Okay, thanks, Arnie. So first we'll start with questions from the working group members. Again, you can click on the hand above the chat window. How about any of the other panelists? Any questions? Okay, I don't see any questions. So let's go ahead and see if anybody on the participant side has any questions. And you can also send it in the chat.
We do have a hand raised on the phone line.
Great, thank you.
All right, caller, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Arnie, this is Carrie with the Western Power Trading Forum. First, I just wanted to say thank you so much for doing this presentation. I've already found it incredibly helpful, and we just appreciate you level setting us before beginning these workshops. I had a specific question, though, on this slide. I'm wondering, and if you're going to get into this later, please let me know. But I'm wondering if there's any documentation on FERC's opinion of setting transfer capability aside for policy goals, something other than reliability criteria. Policy goals meaning our renewable goals.
Yeah, Carrie, that's a great question, and thank you for the question. I would say there's going to be one reference later on to why the requirements for how you designate a resource as serving native load are appropriate, and why they're appropriate even in the context of state procurement goals. I would say, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get there, but when FERC was approaching that question during Order 890, which was around 2007, the state procurement goals really went more to like generic IRP and less to goals around clean renewable portfolio standards. So in that sense, I don't think there really is much that FERC has said about whether or not you can set aside capacity for a state to achieve its renewable portfolio standards. The one place this has come up is in the merchant transmission event or space. And so, outside of open access, there's also this opportunity, and it's happened the most in the West, where a kind of like the gas pipeline model, a company, a developer will develop a transmission line. They will do an open season to see if there are any entities that would like to use that line, and they will do a competition to see if that line is oversubscribed, who would get to use it, and they will establish criteria to do that. At one point, there was a developer, I think in New Mexico, that wanted to use whether or not the applicant, the potential user, was going to use it for a renewable resource because the state had a renewable resource goal. And FERC said, as admirable as that goal is, the kind of resource is not relevant to whether the entity seeking service should get a preference. So in that merchant transmission case, FERC said it has to be resource neutral. So the access to open access principles for a merchant transmission line dictate that it be resource neutral, and it can't give a preference to one resource type over another. I hope that helps and answers the question.
It does. Thank you. Very interesting and helpful.
All right, and I do not see any additional questions in the verbal queue at this time.
I don't see any in the chat either. So if you want to continue, Arnie, I'll go to the next slide. Great,
next slide. So, appreciate that. Most of what I've said is probably a little mom and apple pie. The stuff that tends to get folks who get worked up about open access issues worked up kind of does come in the form of how the details work. So, what is needed to establish an existing transmission commitment that's eligible for primary network service, and really that's the native load preference. It really is it's the requirement for properly designating a network resource. I should say, in all of the places where I identify Order 890 in a paragraph number, I've tried to take FERC's language as close to verbatim as possible. Sometimes, taking we and turning it into FERC. But, what FERC has talked about and what talked about in Order 890 is to designate a resource that will then, be the means by which native load will get a preference. Native load has to own or purchase that resource, and it has to be available to meet that network customer's network load on a non-interruptible basis. It also has to, that network resource has to be pursuant to an executed contract. So it can't be a hope or a dream. It can't be a plan. It can't be, even a request for proposals in the future. The preference and the ability to set aside capacity associated with a network resource occurs when you have an executed contract. Over time, a number of disputes kind of came about regarding whether a particular contract was sufficient for meeting this definition. And so really these clarifications that FERC describes in paragraph 1433 of Order 890, most of these came from cases where someone brought a case to FERC and said, listen, I think this contract was designated as a network resource, and that was inappropriate. And so through a series of cases, largely in the late 90s and early 2000s, FERC kind of provided a little bit more guidance on, what kind of contract is acceptable. The contract does not have to be backed by a specific generator. It does not need to require the load serving entity to take energy around the clock. It doesn't, if it's a firm, it has to be a firm purchase, but it doesn't have to be backed by a capacity purchase to qualify. But because it has to be available on a non-interruptible basis, the third-party transmission arrangements to deliver the resource to the network have to be non-interruptible as well. So, essentially, if it's an external resource, it has to get to the home balancing area on firm point-to-point. I want to emphasize that these are the requirements for a resource to be designated as a network resource. These aren't, Vistra doesn't view this as necessarily the requirements that would make it a good capacity resource, for instance, or a good RA resource, for California. But these are what FERC has said are the requirements for a resource to be designated as a network resource, and therefore these are the clarifications that would allow transfer capability to be set aside. What kind of preference then does native load get for a network, an off-system purchase that qualifies? They get a higher reservation priority. So ATC is set aside in the form of an existing transmission commitment. You want to make clear that there's kind of a timing element to all of this, in the sense that as you set up the system, you kind of look out and say, what are the kind of the properly designated network resources? What are the existing transmission commitments associated with them? Take that ATC off the table. And that will be dependent on the term of that contract. So, some contracts will be, a year long, some will be 10 years long. It might be the case that having done that, you look out, say, 2 years, and there is still available transfer capability. At that point, once you've established that there is available transfer capability, new designated network resources are on equal footing, but not higher footing than another firm transmission request. So if, looking 2 years out, there's available transfer capability and another firm use came in and said, I would like to use that, it would have the same priority for reservation as a new designated network resource. And then in terms of curtailment priority, firm uses, including designated network resources, have the highest curtailment priority, so they're the last things to be curtailed through the transmission loading relief procedures. This might be a good spot to stop, because this is an area that often has lots of controversy around it.
Sure, and I know that Milo had a question, so if you want to go first, and then if any of the working group members or panelists have questions, can raise your hand. If you're not able to, or if you're having difficulty using that hand icon, you can also just speak up. But we'll go with Milos first. Don't forget to unmute yourself, Milos.
All right. Thank you, Christina. And thank you, Arnie. Really appreciate your presentation and taking the time to walk us through this. Let me ask on this concept here. Is the only way to establish that native load priority based on this slide and what you've read, the only way to establish that priority through a designated, through a formal designation of a network resource that meets all of the requirements, it has to have a contract, et cetera? Or is there also an ability to establish that native load priority through, a forecast of a resource that a load serving entity may have? And I'm thinking, for example, load serving entity, is has load on a long-term basis, and they're planning on procuring resources based on certain load change projections 5-10 years down the line, but they haven't yet procured the resource. Is the suggestion that the only way to establish that load priority and set aside that transmission capacity that the resource has to be under contract and designated, or can that transmission provider take into account the future plans of that load serving entity and things that they may not have under contract and set aside transmission capacity under that native load priority for those future needs? And hopefully that was clear enough. If not, I can re-ask it.
Yeah, no, Milos, thanks for that question. And it's a good question. I would say it is fairly absolute that you can't set aside available transfer capability for a future planned resource that is really just kind of planned on the planning stage. The caveat here, in my experience, has been you can, for instance, as you look forward, do a projection of load growth, for instance, back in the days when you actually had load growth. And if a transmission provider was looking forward and thought, okay, in the next year, my load will grow by 2%. If it will also grow by 3%, 2 years later, load growth can be accounted for. Typically, the most typical example is that load growth would result in already existing network resources being dispatched at a higher level. When they're dispatched at a higher level, they would be used more often. And when they're used more often, that would take some available transfer capability off of the system. So it's definitely okay to look forward, forecast for load growth, and say, I don't want to sell capacity that I know I'm going to need or I believe I'm going to need to accommodate future load growth. But in some circumstances, if this is more typically in the vertically integrated utility world that's doing an integrated resource plan, once a resource that is owned is sufficiently well advanced, so you're building a new gas plant to serve some of that load growth. You can set aside a resource for kind of a known, you can set aside transfer capability for a known resource that has been approved through an integrated resource plan. But it's a specific thing. So it's the real important thing there is it is sufficiently far advanced and it is specific. It is at a specific location on the network, and that location is specific enough that with combination with a load growth assumption, you could do a load flow study to see what the impact on available transfer capability would be.
I think Anthony has a question. Go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, I just want to confirm that the firm's transmission requirement is from the point where title transfers to the LSC and not from the specific resource. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And that actually did come up in Order 890. And that was the subject of a couple rehearing requests or clarification requests. And so you're exactly right. It's really from the kind of the point of receipt where the LSC is saying, yes, I've taken possession at this point. That's exactly right.
Any questions, Anthony?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, any of the other panelists have questions? No, we do have a stakeholder. Abby?
Dan, your line is now muted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Arnie. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Again, echoing Carrie's comment, thank you for giving this presentation and sharing your very long history with all of this. I think it's very illuminating. My question may be unfair and better left for maybe one of the future working groups after having a chance to think about it a little bit more. But I'm just curious in your kind of discussion of FERC's order on the export load and wheeling filing, if you have any thoughts on how much we're at risk for that. Hearing requests are taken up that I believe are still hanging out there in that docket. And is there anything, sort of that you found compelling in the rehearing requests that may cause us to think differently about that? And I realize that may be an unfair question, so maybe it's just something to consider for a future meeting.
Yeah, I'm happy to share my own personal view. And this one is, I think you can take with a grain of salt. We did feel like FERC pushed the envelope a bit on how it balanced, how it did balance the native load, the California native load customers against other users of the transmission system. And I think my own personal view, there is a little bit of risk. There is some risk that they went beyond where they had gone in prior precedent, and didn't really describe it as a deviation from that precedent. So I think, but in my mind, I think FERC made the decision they made. And so I guess I'll be surprised if they're convinced on rehearing. And the only place it would, the only place it would really come up with is if it went to an appeals court. I think they might have a more difficult time at appeals court, but appeals courts also give agencies a lot of deference, especially on something as technical as this. So, I don't think it's a slam dunk that it gets through both the rehearing and the appeals process, but I also don't know that it's far from a certainty that anything will change.
Okay, appreciate those thoughts.
Adam, let's go ahead and take Abby's question, and then we'll go back and take questions from the panelists.
Yeah, So this is Abby Nolf with Bonneville Power Transmission. I just wanted to ask the question, if that first clarification there, that a resource can be designated for a system purchase that's not backed by a specific generator, is that specific for an off-system purchase?
Yeah, Abby, thank you for that. That is exactly right. Yes, if it's, once you're within the system, it has to be a specific resource. For an off-system purchase, that's a great clarification.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's see if we have anybody else on the panelist side. And then Abby and Anthony, just remember to lower your hands if you're done asking questions. Let's go ahead and take questions from the participants.
All right, we do have a question on the phone line. Caller, your line is being unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Laura Trelease from the Bonneville Power Administration, and I had a follow-up question on this scenario where you might hold out for native load growth and maybe you don't have a specific resource, but you have a specific enough information, maybe a point of receipt, for example. How long can the transmission provider hold out capacity for that? At some point, I would assume that there would have to be more specific information about that resource for the TSP to continue to hold out that transmission. Is that correct? And do you have a sense for what time frame that is?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know of a case where that was litigated at FERC to the point that they have opined on that. I'm trying to think through the open access audits that I know that FERC has done and that I was part of, and I don't know that question even came up in that context. So I don't know of a public source where that really has opined on that level of detail. I think you've identified the right way to think about it, though. Which is, I don't think most people would argue. I don't think FERC would argue with if you're forecasting load out for 1, 2, 3 years. And yes, at that point of receipt, you have a level of detail. If it's a new resource, I think it's a level of detail. If it is an off-system purchase, I think FERC might expect it to be a contract. But I think if you're talking about like a 20-year forecast or a 10, at the very edge of the time frame for which you're calculating ATC, I think there is a point at which it would feel tenuous enough that there would start to become concerns about holding it aside.
Yeah, that's helpful. For some reason, I had it in my head that you can hold it out for over a year, and let's say it's an off-system resource, that then they would need to have the contract in place if they were within the 1-year time frame, but maybe there's not such a time frame in place.
Okay, any other questions?
We do not have any additional questions in the queue at this time.
Great, thank you, Adam. And I think Anthony has his hand up from before. You ready to go?
I double muted myself. I do have a comment on the person who asked about the request for rehearings of the July order. Actually, I think they were denied by operation of law in late August. So that's it. And yeah, I don't believe anybody appealed it. At least I haven't seen that. So I think that's the end of those issues.
Anthony, what I don't remember is FERC when they put out those notices have 2 versions. One that says essentially it's denied by operational law and we're not going to do anything more, and then another version that says it's denied by operational law but we do plan on providing additional substance. I personally don't remember which version it is, and so without the specific memory, I don't know whether to expect additional words from that. But I don't know, maybe you remember whether they were specific about which version of denying by operation on law they did.
I'd have to go back and take another look. I thought it was the former, but it's been a few months, so I need to go back and take a look at that.
It's a new world where we have to read FERC notices like we're doing Kremlin watching.
All right. I don't see any other hands raised. Anybody on the phone side, Adam? Anyone that I can't see on my
phone? In the verbal queue at this time.
Okay. All right, Arnie, you want to go to the next slide?
Yes, please. So, specific to off-system purchases, FERC does have some requirements, and this was a big issue in Order 890, and this was something that over the years between Order 888 and Order 890, there was a decent amount of controversy around, and so FERC detailed additional requirements for off-system purchases that would be designated as network resources. And here I think they helpfully identified the policy consideration, which is that the off-system resource cannot be so vaguely defined that you cannot determine the effects on ATC. What does that mean? The details are, and they're listed here, it's identified as an off-system purchase, identify the amount of power for which the customer has rights, identify the control area from which the power is originating, identify the delivery points to the transmission provider system, and then identify the transmission arrangements on external transmission systems. And to the clarification before, that is from the place that the network customer is taking title to the balancing area. The important implication of this is that the off-system purchase details drive ATC. So once you know what the resource is off-system, then you can determine how that affects interface capacity and ATC on that interface capacity, and really ATC once you're in the balancing area. And not that ATC is first set aside and an off-system purchase can fill in up to some set amount. There are also some additional details that can be kept confidential, or so they would not be posted on OASIS. And those details go to any operating restrictions, and then the approximate variable generating cost for redispatch. The second one, I'm not sure how often external resources are part of a redispatch scheme that are designed to kind of do as part of it, like a transmission loading release process. But that last element, that's what that's for. That is in case that off-system resource would be redispatched along with all the other network resources to relieve a transmission overload. Let's see. Yeah, maybe this is a good spot to pause as well.
Yeah, so we'll start with questions from either the working group members or panelists, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the participants. So again, select the hand icon above the chat window. Looks like Jeff. Yeah, Jeff, and then Milo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead,
Good
Jeff.
afternoon. Good afternoon. So we're talking about network customers on this slide. Is that at all applicable to the ISO system?
So my translation of that, as and that's a good. I think that's a very fair point. That all of this is, is been written about in the context of a traditional vertically integrated utility operating its balancing area that has a transmission, that is serving as both a transmission provider and also has generation that is being used to serve load. And that has to be translated to an ISO setting. And once you translate into the ISO setting, a lot of this goes away internal to internal to the ISO, because the security constrained economic dispatch, security constrained unit commitment process is optimizing access to the transmission system. I think these principles are still valid. I mean, Vistra's view is these are still valid when you're talking about interface capacity. So, the interface between the ISO and external regions. And in that context, the network customer are the customers, the load serving entities that are paying the transmission access charge, which is the moral equivalent of paying for network transmission service. And so network customer, I translate in an ISO setting to the load serving entities within the ISO.
Any other questions, Jeff? So Connor has his hand raised as well. Milos? Okay, we'll go to Connor.
Hi, Arnie. This is Connor Blake from PG&E. I just had a clarification question on the external transmission arrangement requirement. So my understanding is that in 890, they said that if the contract was sufficiently firm, you needn't worry about the external transmission or you needn't worry that the external transmission arrangements are firm. Is that understanding correct?
So that's not my understanding. So I think there are two issues that you're probably identifying. One was do you have to worry about the transmission arrangements before the network customer takes title to the power? So, if the and the commission decided, and I think this was actually the subject of at least one rehearing request, the commission decided, no, I really only need to keep track of the transmission arrangements where the load serving entity takes title. So in context of California, if the load serving entity, for instance, takes possession of the resource in the Portland General Electric balancing area, then you would establish that there is firm transmission from Portland General Electric to the border with California. But you wouldn't worry about if that resource, if, for instance, if that was like a system purchase from the Portland General Electric balancing area, you wouldn't worry about what the transmission arrangements were to get any additional power to the Portland General Electric balancing area. You would just worry about it from Portland General Electric to California, because Portland General Electric is where the network customer took title. If instead the network customer took title at the border of California, at the CAISO interface, then you wouldn't have to worry about behind California what those transmission arrangements were. So it really does go as far as I remember, or 890, and I looked at this a little bit when I was getting ready. You worry about the transmission arrangements from where title changes hands. The other issue, I think, you might be thinking about from Order 890 is the commission really grappled with what the transmission provider, in this case, what CAISO, what they should be verifying. Should they verify that there are transmission arrangements? The answer is yes. Verify that there are transmission arrangements for where the title for the network resource changes hands. Should they worry about the contract? Should they look behind the contract and ask whether the contract itself is sufficiently firm? And there the commission decided that it shouldn't do that for a variety of reasons. And so the commission decided that the network customer would just attest that that contract met all the requirements to be a network resource. And the transmission provider could rely on the attestation by the network customer that the contract itself is firm.
Got it. That's very helpful. And just to make sure I fully understand, so say you had something like a WSPP Schedule C agreement with a point of delivery at a CAISO intertie. My understanding of what you said is only after that point of delivery would you need to worry about any transmission arrangement.
That's how I understand Order 890.
Okay, great. Thanks, Arnie.
Milos, did you have a question?
No, I lowered my hand. You can go ahead with Abby, I think.
Great, thank you. So Abby, go ahead. Just remember to unmute yourself.
There it went. Okay.
There you
Thank
go.
you. Sorry. I was double muted apparently. So to that first point, I guess I'm wondering, I'm trying to remember 890 now, which is too long ago in my memory banks. Was there also comments about the fact that customers shouldn't be able to designate off-system resources that would prohibit the necessary systems to be able to redispatch those resources if needed?
Abby, that's a good question. And so this is the section of Order 890 I worked on as a staff member. I have a vague memory of that coming up, but I just don't remember the details.
Okay, it seems like those are sort of correlated. There's both, they have to give us enough details that we can appropriately plan the system, and ATC is, often used as a component of that planning effort. But then also, we're supposed to be able, as a transmission provider, to redispatch non-federal designated resources. And if they're designated resources that we know nothing about, we can't get the appropriate communication systems in place to be able to do that effectively. So it just seems like there's sort of that there are other reasons why customers should be able or maybe shouldn't be permitted to designate resources if they don't give us enough information to do all sorts of things.
I think I completely agree with that principle, and that's the principle by which FERC was traditionally thought about it. And I do think this approximate variable generating costs for redispatch computations does speak to that is the expectation, that an off-system designated network resource is expected to be part of a redispatch if needed.
Okay, thanks, Arnie.
All right, any other questions? Any participants have questions?
We do not have any questions in the verbal queue as of yet.
Okay, I don't see any in the chat, so we can move forward, Arnie.
All right. So, having just described these limitations, there was definitely at the time of Order 890, a reaction that some of the restrictions were we're raising the bar on when when network customers or native load customers, when they got the preference. And so there were a number of kind of very high level, I won't say attacks, but high level arguments that said, FERC had gone too far, it should be easier for the native load customer or the network customer to establish the preference because it should be easier to designate a network resource. One of those arguments was that new in 2007, a part of EPAC 2005, was a new provision of the Federal Power Act, Section 217. Section 217 established that existing transmission customers should have kind of appropriate access to the transmission system. And so a number of commenters said, hey, listen, these restrictions you're putting on designation of network resources, they violate this new provision in the Federal Power Act that says that existing transmission customers should have access to transmission service. And FERC's response to that was, no, Congress did not require load serving entities to be able to take transmission service without limitations of any kind in order to serve their native load. And nothing in Section 217 suggests that they cannot be required to comply with the reasonable requirements that are necessary to prevent undue discrimination and to maintain transmission, a reliable transmission system. So FERC said, again, in balancing these interests, the level of detail required to designate a network resource, especially an off-system network resource, still is consistent. That balance was right because some level of reasonable restrictions are necessary. Again, and I want to keep coming back to prevent undue discrimination because that's the thing that FERC cares about. The other thing that FERC said, and the other argument that FERC got was, FERC, hey, you're overstepping your bounds. You are by establishing these set of restrictions, you are trampling over states' rights. You're impermissibly creating conflicts with state mandated procurement plans. And Carrie, this goes back to the question you asked earlier. In 2007, those state mandated procurement plans most often, at the time, were really integrated resource plans. And requiring the level of detail that FERC was requiring, did that interfere with a state's ability to do integrated resource planning, identify off-system opportunities as being the most economic, but then wanting to set aside capacity to make sure that off-system opportunity was still available, consistent with the state mandated integrated resource plan? And FERC's response was no. Even going back to order number 888, it's required contracts to be executed and imposed reasonable restrictions on the type of resources that were designated as network resources. And so again, back to the balancing language, I think Order 890 has some important language that highlights that in doing that balancing, it is still appropriate to establish a set of reasonable restrictions. And again, reasonable restrictions to avoid undue discrimination. Again, maybe we do one more slide and then I'll take questions. Yeah, and so the last part of kind of, how else can, network customers and native load customers, how else can they serve their needs? And how do they get, how do they take advantage, to that concern about doing integrated resource planning? And sometimes there's an opportunity purchase that is more affordable. How does a network customer get preference to use an off-system purchase that might not qualify as a network resource? And it might not qualify for lots of reasons, the most typical reason often was it materialized kind of, in the operating horizon. It was an economy energy purchase that materialized on day ahead or in real time. And I think that we got questions about this earlier, could the network customer or native load customer say, could you set aside some ATC for potential economy energy purchases that will only materialize, day ahead or in real time? And the answer is no. You can't set aside ATC ahead of time, but you can use network service to take advantage of those economy energy purchases. That service that associated with that, that purchase by a network customer that is not a designated network resource gets lower curtailment priority than other firm transmission, but higher curtailment priority than other non-firm uses. This is referred to as secondary network service. It's an as-available service, so it is available if there is non-firm ATC available on the system. And again, importantly, the network customer should not be permitted to lock in such service in advance of other non-firm uses of transmission. It also became, this was an issue that was part of a number of audits before Order 890, of whether the network customer, if they had an off-system purchase, and that off-system purchase had been designated as a network resource, and so ATC had been set aside for that designated network resource, but that resource wasn't available for whatever reason. It wasn't economic, it was on outage. Can the network customer use the ATC that's been set aside for that resource that's not being used, and instead, use an economy energy purchase? And the circumstances I was familiar with from my audit days was, you might even get a purchase delivered to where that designated network resource was, and then it seems like, well, gosh, there's ATC available all the way because that ATC had been set aside for the designated network resource. And FERC said, no, that you can't do that. You can't allow the network customer to use the firm transmission capacity that was reserved for a designated network resource in circumstances, because that would unduly preference the network customer over potential users of that firm capacity. And FERC identified two kind of considerations, or two things that they would worry about in that circumstance. One, using the capacity that had been set aside for a designated network resource would shield that economy energy purchase from a curtailment, because it wasn't viewed as a non-firm transmission service. It was being viewed as high a priority or curtailment priority as the designated network resource. And the other concern was that transmission service might not be available. That service has been set aside. There's no firm ATC associated with that's available because that designated network resource is still there. So if the customer had gone and sought transmission service, there might not have been any available, and so allowing this kind of substitution would provide an undue preference. So as a result, there's an opportunity to use transmission service associated with non-designated network resources, but there are definitely limitations associated with that. And that's probably a good spot to stop for questions.
So again, we'll start with questions from the working group members or panelists, and then we'll go to the rest of the participants. I don't see any questions from panelists, so let's go ahead and see if the participants have questions. Again, you can select the hand icon above the chat window or press #2 on your phone if you dialed in directly.
All right, and I do not yet see any questions in the verbal queue at this time.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move on.
All right. So the next element that I wanted to talk about was capacity benefit margin. And this is important, I think for a number of reasons. One is because it is a mechanism that the transmission provider can use to, maintain reliability. It's important because FERC did reference the capacity benefit margin. Without saying capacity benefit margin, in the wheeling import and export priorities order, they referenced this section of Order 890 as establishing this kind of ability to set aside APC to meet reliability criteria. So I think it's important to kind of understand how FERC thinks about capacity benefit margin, at least how I thought about it, in Order 890. So, here again, mostly direct quotes from Order 890 itself. It is appropriate to allow the load serving entity to retain an option of setting aside transfer capability to maintain their generation reliability requirement. And why? Because without that, the load serving entity would have to increase their generation reserve margins by contracting for generation capacity, which may result in higher costs without additional reliability benefits. So, here FERC recognizing that in meeting a reserve margin and managing through emergencies, reserving some part of the transmission capability is appropriate. Because if you don't do that, then you add costs and you don't increase reliability. However, FERC does require standards for how CBM is determined, how it's allocated across transmission paths, and how it's used to limit the misuse of the transfer capability set aside as CBM. FERC said it wouldn't mandate a particular methodology, but noted, for instance, one approach would be to base it on the location of outside resources or spot market hubs that the LLC has historically relied on during emergencies, resulting from an emergency deficiency. I think, for me, one of the important elements of kind of this description is, a real direct connection to using this transfer capability only during an emergency. FERC also said that when NERC went to go develop the CBM related standards, it should specify the generation deficiency condition during which an LLC will be allowed to use the transfer capability. So CBM is not for everyday use. It's not a way to set aside capacity so that you can kind of reserve capacity for like an economy and energy purchase. That's not the point of CBM. It's not a loophole. It's transmission that's set aside for use during a specified generation deficiency. Though FERC did say that the transmission that's set aside for capacity benefit margin can be freed up as in non-firm APC. So you don't have to set that CBM amount aside when allocating or providing non-firm transmission service, because the logic being, if there's an emergency, those non-firm uses will be curtailed, and when they're curtailed, then the capacity that's been set aside to meet the emergency will be available for that purpose. But if there's not an emergency, then there really is actually additional transfer capability and let's make sure that that additional transfer capability is available to the market on a non-firm basis. Let's do the next slide, because I think it's interesting to see kind of how MISO, another ISO, implemented the CDM requirements. So MISO has a method for, and does set aside some transfer capability as capacity benefit margin. In MISO, MISO will only use that CDM capacity when it's experiencing a declared NERC emergency, energy emergency alert 2 or higher. So it's got to be a sufficiently high energy emergency before CDM will be utilized. And then MISO's tariff also describes how it will determine the amount of CDM to hold aside, and it does that by doing a loss of load expectation study. And I think as part of that, it's looking at as part of that LOE study, what's the historic use of external resources during an emergency to get you to the appropriate loss of load expectation, and that defines the amount of CDM that's set aside. So with that, that's a good spot to pause and take questions.
All right. Does anybody on the panelist side have any questions? We'll start there first and then go to the participant line. All right. Looks like Abby has her hand raised, so we'll go to you first, Abby. And don't forget to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. So Arnie, that first bullet that's presented right now, isn't that a requirement directly out of the mod 004 of the ATC suite of mods?
Yeah, it might very well be.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. Abby, thanks for that clarification.
Okay, let me scan to see if any other panelists have questions. If you are on the participant side, go ahead and select the hand icon above the chat window. If you dialed in, you can press #2, but it does look like Bonnie Blair has a question, so we'll go to Bonnie.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. I work with the Six Cities group. So looking at the second bullet on slide 12, that suggests to me that what they call the generation capacity import requirement is based on an LOLE type study or an LOLE study that is sort of independent of the whole network resource designation process. Is that your understanding?
Yes. I will say that I know MISO a bit, and MISO does have, I've been along for too long. MISO at least at one point had official designated network resources that I think that was before MISO had a capacity market. I think now that MISO has a capacity market, the resources that are capacity resources, are kind of serve the purpose of being designated network resources. And so to the extent that the internal resources, that loss of load expectation is deciding how many internal resources do I need, and then how many external resources can I count on? And so in that sense, it is considering the, probably the moral equivalent of what you would think about as a designated network resource. But, fair that in MISO, that probably is not officially a designated network resource. It's an internal capacity resource.
But But the generation capacity import requirement doesn't seem to, I mean, that doesn't seem to have anything to do with internal resources, right?
No, that's right. That's right. It's as part of that study, that study determines how much internal capacity do I need, and then that internal like reserve margin will account for the fact that during emergency conditions there is some ability to rely on external resources. Those external resources won't likely be capacity resources, but they will just be essentially purchases that you can make from a neighbor when you're meeting when you're in kind of a high load period.
Okay, thanks.
Bonnie? All right, do we have any questions from the participants? I don't see any hands raised, but there might be somebody on the phone who has a question.
We do not yet have any questions in the verbal queue.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move on then to slide 13.
All right, we are at the end. So the last component that that is relevant to this discussion is the transmission reserve margin. It is really transmission capability that's set aside to address modeling uncertainties, and it's FERC in Order 890 kind of described the circumstances where a transmission provider was allowed to set aside some transfer capability to account for the fact that when modeling the system to determine like the total transfer capability, you have to recognize that there's load forecast error and load distribution error. There's variation in facility loadings. There's a lot, a long list of uncertainties that go into the modeling of the total transfer capability of the system itself. Two, I think, that are particularly important to note are the loop flow impact, and the one kind of outlier from the uncertainty side is automatic sharing of reserves, number 6. I think the idea is, and this was the real issue during Order 890, was one, there was some confusion of what to put in the capacity benefit margin versus what to put in the transmission reserve margin. So, where do you put these modeling uncertainties? Should you even load those modeling uncertainties into the total transfer capability? So maybe you just reduce your total transfer capability to account for these uncertainties. And one of the real concerns during Order 890 was transparency and consistency. And so TRM is the means to say, no, we appreciate that there are going to be these modeling uncertainties. We want you to account for them in a specific spot. That specific spot is TRM. And if you describe how you're going to do that, then everyone will know that the reason there's some capacity that looks like it should be available that's not being made available to anybody is because you're accounting for these uncertainties. In preparation for this meeting, I looked at like New York ISO. For New York ISO, their really big issue is loop flow. They're kind of in the middle of the Eastern Interconnect. They get loop flow from lots of different areas. My memory, if memory serves, TRM for New York ISO is almost entirely loop flow. Because the load, all these uncertainties constantly deviate, FERC did not require the TRM set aside to be made available for non-firm uses. So, I think FERC's thought in doing that was these uncertainties could mean that there's actually less transfer capability on the system, and let's not make that available. Let's not require that to be available to non-firm uses, because that might be oversubscribing the system even on a non-firm basis. So unlike CDM, TRM does not is not necessarily set to zero in a non-firm APC calculation. And the last element of this is there is this part of TRM that is designed to accommodate automatic sharing of reserves. My memory of these discussions was this is for like a group of utilities that are in a reserve sharing, like a formal reserve sharing pool. And it is, the opportunity to set some transfer capability aside to recognize that one utility may need to dispatch resources to meet another utility's emergency as part of a formal reserve sharing pool. And you want to, because those are good things, because, reserve sharing pools are good things, you want to allow the transmission provider to set some capacity aside to facilitate those reserve sharing pools. So with that, again, any questions?
Okay, let's see if any of the panelists have questions first. Again, raise your hand if you have a question. All right, I don't see any questions from panelists. How about the participants? Just raise your hand if you have a question, or you can send it in the chat also.
We do not yet have any questions in the verbal queue.
Okay. Any last words, Arnie?
No, I apologize for not landing with a more interesting topic at the very end. But other than that, I want to say, one, really appreciate all of the additional experience that folks brought with your questions and the very valuable clarifications. That was, really helpful and very much appreciate that. And then just a final expression of appreciation to the ISO staff for giving us this opportunity.
Great, thank you, Arnie.
Yeah, thank you very much, Arnie. We really appreciate you taking the time and sharing this information with us and taking all the questions. I know it's not easy, but you did a great job, and we really appreciate you sharing some of this information with us. And I think it's going to set us up well for the upcoming discussions of the next few meetings when we get into really some of the practical aspects of this and understand, how do different transmission providers inform how they ultimately set aside that transmission capacity for native load and derive the ATC across the different time horizons. So we really appreciate you taking the time and level setting us for future discussions.
Thank you. So let's just check if there are any final questions before we conclude. I do have the slide up. We did record the meeting today, so we'll post the video file out on the initiative webpage, which is linked on this slide here. And then the next working group meeting is on the 15th. And so you can find those details out on the ISO's calendar. And Idaho Power is going to present their practices. So any other questions? Yeah, go ahead, Milos.
This is Milos. I'll just note as well, I think in response to one of the questions at the beginning of the discussion, to the extent that any questions come up after you've had a chance to think about the presentation or any clarifications that you have, by all means, feel free to send us a note at ISO, or maybe Christina, you can share the email address, and then we can circle back with Arnie or provide any other clarifications when we start back up on the next meeting on the November 15th. But if you have any questions on anything that was discussed today, just send us a quick email.
Yep, and I am sending out the email address.
So,
go ahead.
Hi, yeah, this is Pete Scala with the CPC. This may have been explained or covered by this issue of NISO's loop flow reserve, and I missed it. And I don't know if this is a question for Arnie or Miloš, but earlier in the in the first interim one of the forums or slide decks, it was observed that both the New York and New England ISOs do not they limit wheels to real time, and I'm just trying to understand, given everything that was just shared, how are they able to do that? And is it just because of this loop flow issue, and it's just a different network? And I'm having a hard time reconciling everything I've just learned with that factoid from that deck.
This is Miloš. Let me go back. Maybe I can follow up with you offline to just better understand the question. And I think you're making the comparison to New York ISO and ISO New England, which I don't think they have I think those are the two I heard. I don't think they have a forward transmission reservation process in place. So maybe let me follow up with you offline just to better understand the question, and then we can circle back to it on November 15th if need be, and provide further clarification for everybody. But does that work for you, Pete?
Okay. Sure.
Okay.
You
okay.
and I know that Danny. Yeah.
You want to just share the email address where folks can send questions ahead of the next meeting if they had any questions on the topics discussed today.
Sure. Yeah, I sent it to all attendees, but you know what? I think I have to send it to everyone, so I just want to make sure I'll add it to that group as well, because that may not include the panelists, the previous one. So, Danny, you want to go ahead with your comment?
Yeah. Thanks, Christina. Can you go back to slide 13 of Arnie's presentation? Arnie, if you're still there, I was hoping if you could shed a little insight on the third clause in the second bullet of uncertainty in transmission system topology. Is this more to kind of capture N-1-1 scenarios over an extended horizon, or is it more just non-credible contingencies? From your understanding of 890, what do you see this provision as?
Yeah, I think I see it as, yeah, no, is as when you for whatever transmission system topology you use to establish total transfer capability, recognize that you might have just outages, but also recognize that you might have other considerations like N-1-1 or a voltage constraint or some other element that is difficult to model, that you want to take account of, but that you'll also document in establishing TRM, to recognize that the system you might be operating with will be different than the system topology that you use to establish total transfer capability.
Okay, I think that helps. So I guess my thinking about this is assuming that you might have an outage from your nominal topology and then have a secure system on top of that, that's N-1 secure. That would just have to be documented then, kind of under this provision?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see anybody else with their hand raised. So thank you very much, Arnie, for the presentation today. Very good information. I know a lot of our stakeholders appreciated it. Again, if you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to the ISO Stakeholder Affairs email, which I provided in the chat. And again, you can find these materials, the presentations, out on the initiative webpage. So thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.